are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Donna Johnson. I'm a board member with the Upper Midwest branch of the International Dyslexia Association. We're very pleased that you're with us for tonight's event, whether you're joining us live or accessing the recorded webinar. With us tonight to speak on the topic of executive function and dyslexia is Dr. Jennifer Petrick. IDA-UMB has had many requests from those who want to learn more about this topic, and we are grateful to Dr. Petrick for addressing it tonight. I want to quickly mention that if you live near Sioux Falls, South Dakota, IDA-UMB is co-sponsoring a day-long conference on literacy and dyslexia to be held 1 week from today on Wednesday, October 4th. Registration closes today, but you can probably still squeak by with a registration tomorrow. Please see upcoming events at the IDA-UMB website or email us at our events email for more information. We'd love to see you in Sioux Falls next week. As always, we want to thank our members, donors, and sponsors for their support of our work, which enables us to bring these webinars to you free of charge. We also thank tonight's presenter, Dr. Petrick, for her willingness to share her time and expertise with us. The last thing we need to do before I introduce our speaker is take charge of some logistics. We have a large number of people attending tonight's webinar and have muted everyone's microphone to make it easier for all to hear. If you have questions or comments, you may type them at any time during the presentation by using the control panel window you see on your computer. Jennifer will respond to questions at the midpoint of the presentation and also at the end. Now, let me introduce Dr. Jennifer Petrick. Dr. Petrick has been teaching children and adults with dyslexia for almost 25 years. She became interested in reading and dyslexia at an early age because both her mother and her brother are dyslexic. Jennifer grew up seeing how their struggles with reading and spelling negatively affected their self-esteem. While in college, Dr. Petrick worked at a learning center where she was trained in multiple Linda Mood Bell programs over a period of 6 years. She became interested in the heterogeneity she observed in her students at the Learning Center and decided to attend graduate school at the University of Maryland, where she earned a PhD in neuroscience. She subsequently worked as a research scientist in labs at both the University of California, San Diego and San Diego State University. She's highly trained in both the Orton-Gillingham approach and the structured word inquiry approach, and she specializes in working with students who have severe phonological working memory deficits, ADHD, and executive functioning deficits. Welcome, Dr. Petrick, and thank you for speaking with all of us tonight.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to do one quick thing, which is going to change the look, but I'll put it right back. I'm just going to move my control panel out of the way. Okay, so in the information that was online, oh, I forgot I have to use this little arrow down here, right? Maybe, yes, okay. This is kind of what I put in terms of what we were going to cover tonight, so just to kind of review the outline. So talk about the development of executive functions, because sometimes you hear executive function, sometimes you hear executive functions, sometimes you hear executive functioning. There's an area of the brain that's responsible for controlling what the rest of the brain does, and it's actually an umbrella term. So there's a set of functions or cognitive abilities that are under that umbrella. So we're talking about the development of those. A little bit about the neurobiology of impaired EF, so what's kind of going on and where in the brain it's happening when you have impaired executive functioning. Now, how it looks in dyslexic students. So my experience has been all with dyslexic students, and it has a lot to do with their language-based impairments, their phonological processing-based impairments, phonological working memory, so we'll talk a lot about that. And then what to do about it. So most of what's out there has to do with accommodations and strategies. There's not a whole lot about what do you do with these students when they have a deficit and you're trying to help them with reading and writing and they have these other comorbid issues that are going on. So we'll talk about that too. So in general, when you talk about executive function, when someone hears it, it's become a very popular term. I feel like I've known about it for a long time and most people didn't know what it was or hadn't heard of it. But now in the last, I don't know, year, or maybe even 2 years, it seems like a lot more people are aware of it. Is it that more kids have problems with it? Is it just more awareness? I don't know. I would say in my experience with my students, I do see more students that have attention issues and executive function issues. And ADHD and executive function often kind of coexist. You might have different problems in different sets of functions if you're ADHD, but usually if you have ADHD, you've got something going on with your executive function system. And if most people think about it, what is executive function? Sometimes they might say, oh, it's problems with planning, it's problems with organization, it's problems with attention, it's problems with self-regulation. It's actually all of those things and more. So let's go into detail a little bit about defining it and then talking about how it looks and what we're going to do about it. So executive function is really a set, like I said before, it's an umbrella, right? So it's a set of cognitive abilities that control and regulate other abilities and behaviors. So executive functions include the ability to initiate behaviors, sometimes called task initiation, delaying or preventing inappropriate responses. So that would be inhibition, inhibiting a response that your brain wants to make. Monitoring, changing, or stopping behaviors. So can you self-regulate? Can you see what's going on and decide to change or stop something that you're doing if necessary? Managing interference. So distractions, other things that are going on around you. Can you kind of filter that out and focus on what you're doing? Can you shift from one thing to another if something does distract you, or you're able to pull your attention away and shift to something else, or shift from one task to another? And planning future behavior when you have something new, something new to do, or you're in a new situation. Can you take what's happened? This is called reconstitution. Can you take what you've learned in past situations and use that to decide what you're going to do in new situations, or to determine how you're going to solve a new problem or complete a new task? And one thing to remember is that all of these things happen on a continuum. More and more in life, I feel like almost everything is on a continuum, but these skills definitely occur on a continuum. So as we walk through these specific executive functions in the next list, just remember, we all probably are better or worse on some of these things. And you probably know people that have trouble in certain ones. And a lot of us can get by, we can figure out what we're doing. But if you have a serious impairment in quite a few of these, then you're gonna start having issues. And it'll show up at home, it'll show up at school, and we'll talk about how those things manifest. So response inhibition is probably the first thing to develop very early in babies. It says capacity to think before you act, also called impulse control, but they can even test, babies. You can train young children to inhibit a response in order to get a reward. I mean, you can do it with animals too, right? So that's one of the very early things, and I think that's really important. Some of these things are so basic, it's kind of like survival. So response inhibition, you could think even something as primitive as you don't want an animal to attack you, so you have to be quiet. That being able to do that, you need to have inhibition. Working memory, so the ability to hold information in memory while performing complex tasks. So an example would be mental math. It's not just that you can hold on to the information, but you can actually manipulate it in your mind. Some people are very good at this. Some people have a hard time with this. And a lot of it has to do with the capacity of their working memory. And you can have phonological working memory. You can have what they call, or sometimes that's called verbal working memory. You can have nonverbal working memory. What you find though is even a nonverbal working memory task. So let's say someone gave you a figure, they wanted you to look at it and hold on to it while they cover it, and then you have to draw it. So you have to draw it from memory. That is called a nonverbal working memory task, but it's interesting that people who have poor verbal working memory or phonological working memory often have trouble doing that kind of task. And it's because a lot of the nonverbal working memory tasks are still language mediated. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we get down to the dyslexics and dyslexic students and what you do when you're working with them. Emotional control, so ability to manage emotions to achieve goals, complete tasks, control and direct behavior, being able to understand one's own feelings and the feelings of others and how to interact with other people. Sustained attention, so that's the big attention, right? So can you focus your attention on one thing and sustain that on that one thing, despite being distracted, being tired, being bored? Are you able to focus that attention? And one thing that's come up in the last year, I guess, is the popularity of these fidget. So it started with fidget cubes, and it went to fidget spinners. So for fidget cubes, their little ad, the guys that first came up with the fidget cubes, they talked about the research that's out there that says, or that supports the idea that if you have something to do with your hands, you can actually sustain your attention longer than if you don't have something to occupy your hands. And I think part of that is you've always got something going on in your mind. Your brain is never asleep, really. I mean, even when you're asleep, your brain's not asleep. So there's always stuff going on. So if you need to focus your attention on something, what do you do with all the other stuff that's going on? And it's nice to have something like fidgeting, having something you can do with your hands to kind of occupy some of that other activity so it's not interrupting what you're trying to focus on. Task initiation. So can you begin projects without undue procrastination in an efficient or timely fashion? This is the first one that when I was thinking about the different functions, I thought, yeah, there's, some of us are better on this one than others. Procrastinating is definitely a problem with a lot of people these days. But, some people may need it for motivation. So you just have to decide. When we get to the end, we talk about some of the higher order thinking skills. You have to decide whether your ability to initiate tasks is working for you or not. Planning and prioritizing. So not only creating a roadmap to reach your goal, but also prioritizing what needs to be done first. What are the most important things that need to be done in order to reach that goal? Organization. That seems like a very common term. Exactly what does that mean? Creating and maintaining systems to keep track, both of information and materials. So one is more cognitive and one is more internal, one is more external. But creating and maintaining a system. So with younger kids, especially ones that have executive functioning issues, you might send them to their room and say, I need you to clean your room. To these kids, that means nothing. They don't really understand what that means. They don't have a system. They don't know how to create a system that allows them to organize these external things, let alone what information they have in their head. And I'll talk about that a little bit later too, in terms of what happens to the information that gets in and gets encoded if it's not organized. Time management, another one I find that some of us are better than others in terms of how much time do you have? How much time is something going to take? How best do you stay within time limits and make deadlines? So that can be something that's a long-term planning issue, or it could even be something that's a monitoring thing. So if you're sitting there working on something, I feel like a lot of people are able to go, well, it's been about 15 minutes. Whereas a lot of kids who have these issues, it's really difficult for them to have a sense of time. It's almost like they're not checking in with themselves. And so they really lose track of time and how long something has taken or how long they've been doing something. And so it makes it hard to plan if you don't have that internal kind of clock and self-check-in ability. So now we're getting into the higher level goal-directed persistence. So not only that you have a goal, but that you're following through to completion of the goal. And when you've got distractions, competing interests, you're able to kind of put them aside and put them off and focus on your goal and persist in what you're doing to the completion of the goal. Cognitive flexibility. So when something happens, you've got this plan, you run into obstacles or setbacks, you have some new information that comes to light, you make some kind of mistake. What do you do with that information? How do you revise your plan so that you can take account of all of these things that have happened and still go and move towards your goal, and you don't get stuck trying to work the plan you had that isn't working or that doesn't take some of this other information into account. And then metacognition is like the top. So this is the ability to stand back and look at yourself and your behavior and your thinking. It's really thinking about thinking. I hear that a lot. So observe how you're problem solving and how you're planning an organization and how all of that stuff that you're doing in terms of these other functions is working, and really thinking about what works best for you. It's kind of, you know, putting what you're learning into practice. So those are that's the set. It's a lot of different functions. That's the main set. So next I want to talk a little bit about how the brain learns, and then talk about different areas of the brain that subserve these functions. I feel like nowadays most people kind of have a general idea of what the brain looks like, but just a quick orientation. So hopefully you can see my mouse. So this little brain here that's a side view. It's facing the left, so the eyes would be over here on the left side. And you have primary sensory areas, and all of those come in, and your brain has to process them, and then they go on for further processing. So we'll talk about all those specific areas later in the next slide. But how does the brain learn? So you've got all of this information coming in through your senses, and you learn by experience. So it's funny, I mean, as a parent, I have young kids, and seeing other people parent and the experiences I've had at parenting, there are so many times where you just want to tell your child something so that they don't have to learn it the hard way. But it's amazing how your brain is just kind of geared to do that. You learn things, if you learn it the hard way, you learn it a lot more effectively than if someone just tells you. And some brains probably need to learn that way more than others, but you learn by experience. And there is a phrase in neuroscience, use it or lose it. And the idea is when something happens, all of the information that's come into your brain, it's not like anything is stored in a cell. It's more stored in multiple cells. And when they are activated together, then you create this network that has activated together. There's another phrase they use, neurons that fire together, wire together. So when something has happened and all of these neurons have fired together, their connections become stronger. If they don't fire together very often, then the connections become weaker. So the use it or lose it has to do with that. So the more you use these pathways and these connections, the stronger they become. And if you don't, then you lose them. And you're born with a certain set of connections, but as you experience the world, you start building a lot more connections, but you also start what they call pruning some connections that maybe you're not using. So like I said, what you want to create then is these neural networks of activation. This is just a picture of neurons and kind of how they're connected. They have these little dendrites that reach out and touch the axons, which are the tails of the other neurons. And you end up kind of getting this chain of neurons that are connected to each other. And so it's this network of activation. That's how we store information. And these networks can be activated what they call bottom up or top down. So you could think of something, which would be kind of at the top, and it could activate all of the other neurons that are connected to it, and that would be top down. Or you could have some sensation from the external world come in, and then now you're activating things bottom up. And both of those, not only are both of those important for learning, but one thing I talk to people a lot is kind of the difference between recall and recognition. Recognition is more of a bottom up, something comes in and you recognize it, versus recall, where you need to pull the information out and bring it down for use, for a response. And a lot of what you'll find with dyslexic students who also have these executive functioning issues, when their information that they've learned is not organized in their brain, it's not connected in a related way, it's not a part of these networks, it's just kind of random bits of information, it's very hard to do top-down activation, which is why, you can see that they know things if you give them multiple choice, for example, but if they have to do a short answer, it's so much more difficult because then they have to activate not only the concepts, but the words that they need. And sometimes that's very difficult for them. So that's one reason why it's so important to make sure that they understand how to encode information in a connected and related way, because it's not only helpful for efficient and effective encoding, but then for accessing and getting that information out. And what's really important for that kind of learning, I'm sure a lot of people in the audience have heard about this, but multisensory instruction. What that means to people is different from person to person, but the idea is you're using all of your senses to encode the information. So in thinking about this, it's kind of funny that there are Greek and Latin versions of some of these. So tactile sensory, it's the same thing. Kinesthetic motor, same thing. Sometimes you'll hear the two of them put together. The idea that you've got sensory and you've got motor, and using input from both of those systems can help encode information in addition to the verbal information. Auditory, listening, that's usually the most common way that a lot of these students are getting information, and visual. So not only visual, like seeing pictures, but also visual, seeing words. So not just hearing words, but seeing words, studying them, learning about the print. All of these pieces can be put together to help make encoding a lot more effective and make access more effective for these students. And we'll talk about that more towards the end. So just a quick overview of the brain areas. You can see the primary, we've got the auditory, the visual, the sensory, and the motor. So auditory is on the side, visual is in the back, sensory and motor on the top. That's where information comes up the spinal cord, up the brain stem, gets to cortex, which is this outside bumpy part. That's the first place it goes. It all goes to these what they call primary sensory areas. Then it has to go on for further processing. And it'll go on to things that are called integration areas, where it starts putting together information from multiple sensory areas. And then you end up with this frontal activation. So we've got the EF skills and we have the motor planning. And so once you've taken in all of this information, your brain kind of has to decide what a response is, or to inhibit a response. And so you're going to use these frontal and prefrontal areas to make those responses. So your motor planning is, I have to make a motor response, so I have to plan what I'm going to do so that my brain can tell my body what to do. And then the EF skills are all the things that we've talked about, going from something as simple as, working memory and working all the way up to the metacognition. So this is kind of the control center of the brain in terms of taking in information and how to respond. So thinking about, of all of those functions, what are the most important? What are some foundational functions? So in some work on EF that's out there, the authors talk about inhibition, working memory, and shifting, or what is also called cognitive flexibility. So like I said, inhibition is the first thing that we need. If you don't have inhibition, it impacts everything down the line, and same with working memory. Those are really core functions that are important. And if you have a problem there, then it's going to impact all of the other functions down the line. And cognitive flexibility kind of requires inhibition and working memory, and it's a little bit higher level, but these are kind of the core functions. Barkley has a model kind of relating a little bit more specifically what's going on. So we've got behavioral inhibition up here, and we've got what it says motor control, fluency, syntax. So this is kind of your response. So controlling what your brain, what your body's going to do, whether you're going to respond physically or whether you're going to speak, that you need this response output down here. And what's happening in between? So we've got working memory that's holding on to the information for us while we manipulate it, process it, decide what we're going to do. We have to regulate our affect, our arousal, our motivation to match the task so we can stay focused and continue with our goal-directed behavior. This is the huge one that we're going to talk about, internalization of speech. So if you've got some kind of issue with your phonological processing, phonological working memory, language, expressive language, you're going to end up having a problem with internalization of speech, which is going to then affect your ability to carry out some of these functions. And reconstitution has to do with that future, okay, I'm going to take all these things that I've learned, I'm going to put them all together and figure out how that's going to direct my behavior going forward, especially in a novel situation. So as we move forward, this internalization of speech, I'm going to elaborate on quite a bit. So just some ideas in terms of parents that might be wondering, does my child have this issue or these issues? What might you see at home? So are they able to plan events ahead of time? Can they start and stop conversations? Are they able to adjust voice, topic of conversation, comments? This one, this adjusting voice one, for me, I have a son who's got a checklist of everything. And so these things, executive function, ADHD, dyslexia, all those things are on his checklist. But this adjusting voice has been interesting because not only does he have a problem with that, but I see so many other students, both that are my clients, but also that I see at school that have this same issue. So that's a very common one, and that's the self-regulation. They're not able to take that information in and regulate their behavior. Can they initiate activities, be on time? This expresses emotions appropriately. That goes back to one of the functions was the emotional regulation and control. Do they have future plans and goals? And are their room and belongings organized? Now, again, like I said, if they don't have their own structure and their own system for organization, it doesn't matter how many times you ask them to organize, they don't know how to do it. If you give them a system and if you use all of the information, all of the sensory instruction, so what the tactile and the kinesthetic and the auditory and the visual, and you can get them to learn how to do it. But it takes a lot more modeling and input in order for them to be able to establish that. In the classroom, how are they with getting their materials ready at the beginning of a lesson? Do they know what's going on? Do they have their materials ready? Are they able, even if they kind of are lost, are they able to look around, see what other people are doing and get everything ready? Are they starting to work when everyone else is? Are they stopping when everyone else is? Can they switch easily between tasks, or do they get kind of stuck on one thing and it's really hard for them to let that go and move on to something else? Can they recognize and respect other people's feelings? That's, again, that emotional control and emotional regulation, not only theirs, but others. Kind of goes in a little bit to theory of mind. I don't know how many people are familiar with that, but the idea that you can step outside of yourself and see what somebody else might be thinking or feeling. On the autism spectrum, kids have, on the autism end of the more severe end, a lot of kids have trouble with that. They're not able to kind of build this theory of mind. What is in my mind is kind of what everybody else knows. And they're not able to kind of understand, like, how I feel about this may not be how you feel about this, or what I know or what I see may not be the same thing that you know or that you see. And do they have difficulty? I mean, this isn't very specific, but do they have difficulty with writing and math and reading? Those fundamental abilities definitely can be affected, especially with if you do have the language processing issues. And you might think math, and it's amazing how many of my students that I have who are dyslexic, who have attention issues and executive functioning issues, who actually have what I would call as a math brain, but they still have trouble in math. And it's true for two reasons usually. One is word problems, right? So when you get to the level where you need to understand print in order to do the math, it can be a little bit difficult. But also, executive functioning is kind of like following steps, understanding something conceptually and procedurally, and being able to direct yourself through the problem. I mean, that's math, totally, everything about math. And so a lot of times they may have, again, some of that information stored here, stored there. There's no language attached to it. They don't know the orders of the steps, or they can't talk themselves through it because they don't have that internal language. So it can really affect them in math, even if they have the ability to understand mathematical concepts. Okay, so as I said before, what are people doing? General accommodations, that's a lot of what you see. So doing everything step by step, a lot of times kids have a really hard time doing more than 2 steps at a time. So you have to do, step by step, relying on visual organizational aids, using tools like time organizers, computers, watches, phones with alarms, preparing visual schedules and reviewing them so that everything that they can see and they can, have something external to help them know what they're supposed to be doing. A big one that I see in accommodations for school is written directions with oral instructions whenever possible, which is multisensory, right? So now you're seeing the directions and you're hearing the directions. But it's not going to fix it for you. It just means you're going to have to always kind of rely on both. And also planning and structuring transition times and shifts, since so many of these students have trouble shifting from one thing to the next. Okay, so this is what I would say. Am I actually, yeah, look at that, pretty good timing. Okay, so this is about halfway. So I want to see if there are any pressing questions before I move into executive function and dyslexia specifically, and what we need to focus on when you're working with those students.
There is one question that I think would be interesting to have you respond to now. Is there an age where you can no longer build the neural connections and network in your brain?
So it's interesting. I would say the answer to that has changed over the years in terms of plasticity, which is the ability to change your connections, right? So how plastic is your brain? I think it's way more plastic than we used to think. And I think that it becomes less and less plastic as you get older. So it becomes more difficult. It takes more intensity. It takes more repetition. It doesn't mean you can't. It's just not as easy. It's not like there's a critical period like there is for language. But I would say the earlier, the better. And I think that's probably true with most things that have to do with the brain. The earlier you start dealing with it, the better the outcome.
Okay, I think that's probably it for right now, and we'll just have you continue.
Okie dokie. So let's talk specifically about how how executive function impairments interact with dyslexia. So as I talked about with the internal language, sometimes people call it self-talk, that is a very important piece of that model of how we get from sensory information coming in and getting processed and then responding. And so what I see is that this is impaired in the students that I have that have poor phonological processing or poor phonological working memory. So phonological just meaning speech related. So if I can't hold on to very much speech information, then it's going to impact everything else that I need to do because I can't hold on to that much language at one time. So you'll see things like if a student is just listening and they're asked a question. I have a range of students in terms of their ability, their processing time, how much processing time they have and their ability to answer questions. But I've had quite a few. It's amazing that if you just give them the time, they can get there, but their working memory is so limited. It's really difficult for them to take everything that you just said, work their way through it, think about a response, and put it together to get it out. And some students just can't do it at all. They just can't hold on to that much information at one time. So when you have that limitation, then you end up running into problems with this internal language. So what I was talking about before with the way that information is stored, you kind of end up with this islands of knowledge. So I've sat in class, I've listened. Most of these students are not taking notes. They might receive notes and maybe they're kind of doing something with the notes that they have, but for the most part, they're really just listening. And there is some information getting in and getting stored, but the problem is maybe there's new vocabulary they've never heard before and they're not able to hold on to it. And there's too much information at one time and they only get half of it. And so little bits of information are here and little bits are here and little bits are here. It's not tied together in a connected way. And I always go back to math just because it is such a strong EF, it relies strongly on EF skills. You know, you say to a student, late elementary, middle school, what are you guys doing in math? I don't know. Okay, well, what's something you remember learning about recently? And they may come up with maybe a word or maybe a picture that they could draw for you and or a problem they could write down. But they have so little language associated with it. And so it's no wonder they're not able to store all this information in a connected and related way to then use it and apply it when they need to. Because if it's all just coming in the auditory, there's not a whole lot they can do in terms of holding on to it and encoding it effectively. So internal language, what do we use it for? A lot of things. I mean, I don't know how many people really notice how much they talk in their head. I'm sure after a while it just becomes automatic and you don't even notice. But when you're first learning to do something new, I mean, that's generally kind of how we walk ourselves through something, even if we don't say it out loud. I notice if I'm in a hurry, sometimes I will start saying things out loud because I guess the capacity when the amount of resources are reached, if I need to speed it up, sometimes just saying it out loud makes it more effective. But following any multi-step directions, right? So for example, a recipe, but anytime you have multi-step directions, like I said, math problems, you need that internal language to kind of walk yourself through it, especially when you're first learning new motor tasks. tying a shoe, swimming. Every kid that I've done EF remediation with, I always start with, did you have trouble learning how to tie your shoe? And not only did most of them have trouble tying their shoe, some of them never even were able to figure out how to tie a shoe. And they tend to either still have, I mean, these are all students, but they tend to either still have people tying their shoe, or they go with Velcro, or they just keep their shoe tied and slip their shoes in, slip their feet in. But, you know, it's hard for them to take that step by step if they have no language associated with it. Copying visual motor input. So letters. How do we form our letters? I feel like a long time ago, it was, you know, and I guess they still are. I think it seems like a lot less time is spent on handwriting now because there's so many other things that people have to cover in school. But it looks like a lot of students are just kind of trying to draw something that matches the letter, and they kind of figure out a consistent way of doing it that works for them. But for some of these students, they may not have a very consistent way of doing it because they're not following the steps every time they do it. So the letters may not look the same every time. And then it means it's a lot more difficult to even write because you've got to think a lot more. It doesn't become automated. For me, I remember when I was learning sign language, for the most part, I was pretty good at copying what I saw. But if something, for whatever reason, if it was a complex sign or my brain just wasn't getting it, I'd be like looking at the person and I'd have to say, okay, so this wasn't an example. Well, maybe China was an example. So China, I'm pretty sure everyone can see me, but China goes across your body and down. And for some reason, when I was watching someone, I was like, I can't, is that this way? Is that this way? And I'd have to turn it into words and say, okay, I need to take my dominant hand to my opposite shoulder, come across, and then down. And that would always help me get into the motor memory system, so that once it was motor memory, then I didn't have to think about it. I didn't need the language. And then also, like I said, establishing these neural networks of activation. So you kind of want what I would say is a domino effect. So I activate one thing, and then that activates other things, which activate other things. You can do an association task. You know, you say something and someone has to think of something that's associated with it. A lot of these students don't have words that are associated. You give them a word and they will tell you about a picture they see in their head. They don't have these words associated in their head at all. So just some examples, you know, New York City. If I say New York City, a lot of people might say, you know, Big Apple. They might, I guess that probably a lot of people would get pictures, but if you said, give me words or tell me what is activated when you think about New York City, you know, Empire State Building, Statue of Liberty, so all these things get activated. Right triangle, I'm sure lots of people go through math, and I have no idea percentage of people that study right triangles in geometry in school, but if you don't use it, I'm sure you don't really keep all of that information connected together when you're older. But for people that do, if you say right triangle, then you get not only a picture of the right triangle, but you get the Pythagorean theorem, which you know is a squared plus b equals c squared, and all these other pieces of information that get attached to it. And if you don't encode things that way, then you might say to a student, okay, have you learned about right triangles? Yes. Okay, what do you know about right triangles? They're triangles. I mean, they really just have nothing. So, and it doesn't, you know, and again, the recognition recall, if you actually wrote down a squared plus b squared equals c squared, they might go, oh yeah, I remember seeing that. They don't know what it is, or they don't know what they're supposed to do with it, but they recognize it because all of that information hasn't been stored in a connected way. So what do we do about this? If they don't have this internal language, what are you going to do to help them develop it? So you definitely need to increase the phonological working memory. There are different ways to do that. A lot of it is just having them verbalize, starting with small bits and working up to bigger. A lot of times when I meet with students the first time, I just want to get a sense of where we are in terms of phonological working memory. I'll give them sentences to repeat, and I'll start with very short sentences and get longer and longer and see where they start to fall down, see what kind of substitutions they start making. What you'll find is when you get to higher vocabulary, if a sentence has employee in it, they might say worker. So they get the meaning, they have the semantic information from the word, but they can't hold on to the phonology of employee because it hasn't been activated enough in their brain. So then they substitute a semantic substitution. So it means kind of the same thing. So if you intentionally work on having them verbalize and having them hold on to phonological information and increase it as you go along slowly, that can make a big difference. Practicing verbalizing externally, which is what I was just saying, but that's really what you need to start with. So if we can get you to a place where you can externally verbalize effectively, then you can start to internalize it. Now, not all EF students will have poor expressive language, but a lot of them do. And what I find, if you ask them a question, so I work with students online and they're usually at home, and sometimes a parent will be around. Either the parent is sitting in or the parent is nearby. And it's amazing how many of them, when I ask them a question, will turn. And they're turning to look at mom, usually. And what's happened is they've had so much trouble verbalizing through their childhood. Mom has always just kind of stepped in and verbalized for them. And it ends up being a habit you have to not only break the student up, but you have to break the mom of. So you have to make sure that, it's not always mom, but whoever is stepping in and verbalizing. I've seen it even with siblings. I had one student a long time ago where the younger sibling was always verbalizing for the older sibling. And once you start that, then their brain never really gets the practice that it needs doing that. So you want to make sure that they break those habits and they start having, and I always say, if you don't know the answer or you don't remember or you forgot what I asked you, any of those responses are fine, but I need them to make a response and get them used to doing that. Then the other big piece of this is using the steps to go from modeling to external to internal. So you want to give them the language in the beginning because most of the time they don't have it. So if you have some task that you want to do, you want to break it down into the steps. You want to say the steps and do them. And so that you're showing them the action and the language that goes with it. So you always want to model that. Then you do it together so that they have both the input of watching you and listening to you and doing it themselves. Then you take turn giving directions. So you say the direction, they have to repeat the direction and do it. And the interesting thing is, so the tying the shoe example, I always start with that. And it's amazing how even the kids who have learned how to tie their shoe cannot verbalize what they're doing. They can do it, they can do the motor task, but they have no idea how to explain it. And so even when you model it and have them do it with you, when it gets to I say and you do, so I give you instructions and you do it, they have a very hard time verbalizing before they do it. They want to do it and then tell you what they did. So we work on that a lot, saying it before they do it. And that takes sometimes for kids a big transition of, slowly being able to do it at the same time and then being able to verbalize ahead. Then you switch it. Then they have to say the directions and you have to do it. And I put here follow instructions exactly because whatever they say is what you need to do. That gives them feedback to help them develop more specific language. Often you get very vague abstract language, it and that, instead of saying, for the shoe tying example, take the right lace and cross it with the left lace. You don't, either lace is not there or they don't tell you whether it's the right or the left one. They just say it or that. So you want to follow the instructions exactly. And if you don't know what to do, you have to ask questions because then they start to realize what they're saying is not specific enough. And they get the feedback they need to help develop the language that they need to be able to give the instructions properly, which is important because if you can't give someone else instructions how to do something, you can't give yourself instructions how to do something. So then once they can give someone else the instructions, well, they can say it out loud and they can do it. And eventually what you want is for them to be able to internalize it. Now this comes into play, the being able to verbalize it, when you're thinking about whether a student has mastered something. It is amazing how often people will tell a student something and the student says, and they're like, all right, they got it, and they move on. But the problem is, unless you've had them verbalize, you have no idea what they've absorbed. And if they aren't able to verbalize it, often it's not going to stick. And you can add other things. That's where the multisensory comes in. I like to add, I know sign language, so I like to add sign language because if they do have the poor phonological working memory, and it's difficult for them to hold on to new vocabulary or to hold on to concepts or directions, if you add something, signs, and you add something that's visual motor, it's amazing. Not only are they often good at holding on to that specific information, but tying it to the language. Once they do the signs, the language comes right there. Now, I know not everybody knows sign language, but you could even use gestures or some kind of signals, but tying it to something else if they are not able to hold on to the language. But as you go through this with different kinds of tasks, what you'll find is their phonological working memory does get better. They get better at verbalizing externally. And then they're able to do more, and they need to rely on the gestures or signs or signals, whatever you're using, less. Okay, so what can you use internal language for? You can, like I said, these are things you can do. So you can practice physical tasks. So you could do shoe tying. I've done jumping jacks. I had a student teach me how to hold a lacrosse stick and how to throw a lacrosse ball. It's nice to be able to find something they can do and have them, especially if it's a motor task that they have to turn into language, and then they can teach you. I had one student teach me how to solve the Rubik's Cube. That was kind of fun because now I know how to solve a Rubik's Cube. Practice imagery tasks. So, what is your routine when you get up and get ready in the morning? Having them think through with imagery instead of actually doing it, thinking through what they do and putting language to it. Drawing on paper. It's something kind of simple, but often I'll do that with my students in terms of, orienting themselves on the paper and planning. Where are we going to start? What kind of information do we need? And being able to give that information to someone else. So let's say you have a figure that you've drawn and you want to give directions to somebody else. How are you going to break that down? What kind of information does the other person need to know to be able to do it? Sometimes it's fun when we've done that part where we're learning how to draw lines and shapes. And again, it's not about drawing the lines and shapes. It's about using language to do it. But, I'll say, okay, you draw a figure and then you need to give me directions to draw it. And then I'll draw it on my end and then we compare and see. And again, that's that feedback. So they can see, oh, I didn't say this, or I didn't say that, or that wasn't specific enough. And they can kind of start to understand what information, what details, how specific they need to be in order to get the information to the other person. And like I said, using with other modalities to store information, so learning new information, language, pictures, gestures, concepts, all of that stuff you want to be tied together in a related way. Problem solving, being able to stop and think through and talk yourself through solving a problem. When my son was in kindergarten, he was in a basketball thing they did after school once a week, and he was in an aftercare that came and picked them up at the school, and they didn't have basketball, and it was some scheduling conflict. But anyway, so the aftercare people come to pick him up. He goes to get on. They said, no, you have basketball. And so he's like, no, I don't think so. And they're like, yeah, you have basketball. So the bus leaves and he goes over to where they're supposed to have basketball and there's nobody there. And so apparently he started to kind of panic, but then saw a teacher and asked the teacher for help. And then of course they called the place and they picked him up. And he told me about this after, and he has anxiety, and we've talked about it before, even at that point in kindergarten, because when you get anxious, and you're not able to regulate that emotion and that anxiety, all of a sudden your problem solving skills, you have a really hard time. You're not thinking, you're not able to use your internal language. But he was so proud of himself because he said, I started to cry, but then I realized I'm not going to be able to solve my problem. So I stopped and thought, and I found a teacher, and I thought, oh my God. Now, of course, we still have some trouble with problem solving, but at least he was starting to get the idea of how to use internal language, how to control his emotions to be able to cope with a situation and problem solve. And encoding new information. So that would be, academic stuff. So we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. So you can apply it in the home environment. You can apply it to academic subjects. You can apply it to the foundational reading and spelling. Some of you have probably heard of structured word inquiry. When I do structured word inquiry, which in the introduction, I think I had put approach, which isn't really appropriate. Structured word inquiry is a method for studying words and studying spelling. But it's a very systematic way of studying words. So you have to know what are the things that I need to look at and think about, and the questions I need to ask myself, and how do I work through that process? And that's an EF process. So even if you're able to show that to a student, you want to make sure that they can do it on their own. And then of course, long-term papers and projects are going to need internal language so that they can plan. So in the home environment, you want to identify the skill that you want improved or the task that you want to be done, and you want to really focus on that. You don't want to focus on changing too many things at one time. So it's really important to identify one thing at a time that you want to work on. Using concrete cues. So in the beginning, lists and charts and signs and gestures, all of those things are going to be really important because you want all of that sensory information coming in. As they start to get better and improve and become independent and regulate things on their own and monitor things on their own, they won't need those. But until they have that internal language, they will. And then always repeat, verbalize. So when I first looked at this, it almost looks like 3 different things, but it's supposed to be repeat/verbalize, instruction/information. So always have your child, your student, repeat things back to you, verbalize their understanding of something, whether it's instructions or information, because oftentimes they will say okay, or they will say yes. They'll give you an answer, or they say they understand, and then you say, why don't you tell me back what you understand of what I just said? And there's nothing there. So you definitely want to make sure to do that on a regular basis. And then you want to abstract yourself out of the process. So in the beginning, like I said, you want to model, you want to be very involved and give them everything that they need. But as you move forward, you want to start pulling yourself out and having them be responsible for more. So for example, when we had trouble with turning lights off, it was, can you please go to your room and turn your light out? And then it was, did you forget to do something in your room? And then it was, is there something upstairs you need to take care of? So I tried to kind of abstract out of the process so that it was more of a, when I come from upstairs to downstairs, I have all these things I have to think about whether I did or not. Instead of, go turn your light off, go turn your light off, go turn your light off. And I've told practicum students that I've had before in other situations, if you find yourself nagging, that's when you need to take the time to get the student to be independent with something. If you have to keep doing it, it's like, okay, this is something that they need to start being responsible for. So you need to start using the verbalizing and the cues and the resources and having them start being responsible for it. And this last thing is just a general parent thing. Reward the behavior you want. It works for animals, it works for people. I mean, even adults, you always want to reward the behavior you want. So whatever you're trying to do, you want to elicit it and reward it. That's the best way to make progress. It's kind of crazy to think about students that have impulse control problems and saying, well, if you do X, Y, or Z, you're going to have a consequence. Well, they can't even stop and think about X, Y, and Z. So they're certainly not thinking about the consequence that's going to come after. So that's not very effective. It's not very punishment. It's not very effective anyway. But rewarding the behavior you want works really well. So we're getting close to the hour. So I have 2 examples for academic, and I think let me see if I go like that. And I think, and just a couple quotes. So I don't know if I should stop for questions now, or if I should go through these examples.
Actually, I think you should do the math because there is a question about that.
Okay.
What do some of the math struggle students have and what can be done to help them?
Okay. So as I said, one of the most important things for anything that you're working on is having them verbalize. Having, if you have to break down and model the steps and the language first, that's what you do. And you want them to be able to verbalize. You want to have them be able to explain how to do a question and not even necessarily telling you what to do. I mean, that would be the first step, but also I'll say to my students, why don't you help me figure it out? You ask me the questions that I need to ask myself. Don't tell me take the 4 and put it there and do that. Say, what do you think you need to do next? Or what are you going to do with this part of the problem? So just the example I have is understanding conceptually and procedurally what to do. So here's an operation subtraction. So this is just an example of what I like to do with investigating the word, looking at where it comes from, and knowing that this base up here comes from this Latin root to pull or draw. And so what is subtraction? It's to take away, it's to draw from below. So then we talk conceptually, what is subtraction? In math, I like to talk about whole versus parts for the different operations. What are we doing? Is this putting parts together? Is this starting with a whole and dividing it into parts or taking a part away? So in subtraction, we start with the whole, we take the part away. If you want to use some kind of gesture or sign, I love the sign for subtraction because you just put your hand out and you just take this piece off and pull it away. So taking away the part, and then what is your result? So once you've taken away that piece, you either have what's left or you have the piece that you've taken away. Drawing pictures, so that's not only, you know, motor, but it's also visual then. Solving an example problem, walking through the steps. What are the steps for solving this problem? And then verbalizing the steps. That is the crucial piece. So in any academic discipline, but especially math, you want them to be able to verbalize at the end their understanding of what the steps are or what the concept is. That's going to tell you whether they're able to be independent and apply what they're learning. And the science example is not. Just quickly, so I've had, this is a couple students, things that they said that I thought, oh my gosh, it's actually working. So after having this one student who very low expressive language, and this was the one that taught me how to do the Rubik's Cube. I mean, his brain was amazing. He could do the Rubik's Cube, and I was astounded that he could do the Rubik's Cube without even having the language in his head to do it. He just did it. It was like this abstract knowledge. But the problem was he would do that with math, and he would just do it. He had no idea whether he was doing it right or how to check the problem. He would just do whatever came into his head. So we definitely had to work on that verbalizing. But one day he had an assignment from me, and he said, I told myself I was going to do my homework assignment when I got home from baseball practice, but then I forgot when I got home. And I thought, not only was he planning, which he never did before, but he actually literally said, I told myself I was going to do my homework assignment. So he planned, told himself what to do. Now he forgot to do it when we got home, and we problem solved and figure out what to do about that. But it was amazing to hear him use that kind of language. And then another student who had so much trouble, you know, often they have trouble filtering, something pops in their head and it just comes out their mouth. And so they end up interrupting a lot. And we were talking about something, and when I stopped and there was a break, the student said, well, this is a little bit off topic, but, and then he went off on a tangent. And I thought, I mean, he actually was able to think before he said it and realize that it was a tangent, and I was able to set that up before he went on to the other thing. And these are kids that I have videos, but without permission, I don't like to show them. But both of these were very low expressive language kids. And to have them be able to think of these things and articulate these things, it just shows how effective they can be when they have practice doing that kind of thing. And these are just resources. If people want to, they're in the handout that'll come with the link for the video. But if they want books to read or resources to follow up with. So if there's any other questions.
There are some here. This goes back to the beginning. How can you address the issues with emotional understanding of others?
So it's interesting because someone just texted me, and she may even be listening, but she texted me the other day, and we were talking about the verbalizing and how difficult that is. And when you think about emotion and your ability to process your own emotions, so much of it has to do with being able to label it and articulate it. So you would kind of use the same example so that if they're having trouble, you model by what you do and giving them the language, and then they can kind of walk through that with you. So when this happens and you feel that way, that's what this is, and this is what we can do about it, and this is what we can say and how we can cope with it. I mean, I do that a lot with my son with anxiety. He has, he's in 4th grade, and it's much better now than it was, but we had to do so much talking and verbalizing, and I'm lucky in that he actually is relatively articulate, but we had to spend a lot of time talking about what is anxiety, how does it feel, how do we recognize that's what it is, what do we do, what do we say, and walking through all of those steps. because so much of what we do is language mediated. And if you don't have the language and the ability to internalize that language, then you're not able to process what's happening with you, let alone with other people.
Okay. Here's another one. How would a child who has auditory processing difficulties, how would this fit in with going through all?
Okay, so auditory processing, just quickly a little bit about auditory processing. Auditory processing, central auditory processing disorder means that you have a hard time filtering out signal from noise. That's any sound. So that's, you know, background noise, and being able to, you know, if you're in a noisy classroom, being able to focus on what the teacher's saying. It's not language per se. It's being able to filter out the signal that you're trying to pay attention to from other surrounding noise. So that's kind of a separate thing, because you can have that and have a phonological processing issue, or you could have that and not have a phonological processing issue. So the auditory processing is really something that's diagnosed by an audiologist. And typically, like in a classroom setting, it's something that is mediated with like an FM system or something that amplifies the signal to noise. So that's a little bit different than the expressive language issue that we're talking about. If they have that, then obviously you would want them to have the accommodations for that. I don't know if a speech language pathologist or an audiologist, I feel like I've heard that some of them have some strategies and activities for kids to help with auditory processing. I can't speak to that because I don't do anything with that. But I just know that that is a separate issue. So sometimes when people say auditory processing, I think what they mean is I'm talking to you and you're not processing what I'm saying and can't say it back to me. But that's not necessarily auditory processing. It is processing auditory information, but when people say central auditory processing disorder or auditory processing disorder, they're talking about something else. If it's a phonological thing, then you want to work on the verbalizing. If it's an attention thing, then you need to work on the attention. And so it can be something where I'm not able to focus my attention on the auditory processing that's coming in. If your ADHD is not bad enough that you need to be medicated, then you need to engage them, again, using other modalities to try and help them focus their attention on the information that's coming in, if just the verbal information that's coming in is not enough.
Okay, there are more questions coming in, and it's just a few minutes after 3, so I think I will continue to have you answer some of them. Are sleep issues, difficulty with getting to sleep, staying asleep, getting restful sleep, common with kids with executive functioning problems?
That's interesting. So I don't know that I would speak to that on the executive function side. I would say on the ADHD side for sure. And that's so tightly linked that I would imagine for most of these kids. When there is so much going on in the brain and they're not able to kind of shut things down, yeah, definitely getting to sleep is difficult. Staying asleep, I don't know. I think nowadays there's lots of kids I know that don't even have attention issues or executive functioning issues, and they all wake up in the middle of the night. I don't know what that's about. I don't know why that's happening. But for sure, if there's ADHD, that can definitely be an issue for being able to, and that, you know, most of the time what they say for that is you have to have the whole routine. That's the transitioning, you know, transitioning from what's going on physical when you're awake and then transitioning into sleep mode. I don't know that, you know, verbalizing or internal language is really going to help that much with that. It's more just how their brain works and what you can do. I'm trying to think, I mean, activity too, something as simple as if you have an ADHD child, sensory issues come into play too. So if you have a child that has lots of energy, then you want them to get lots of activity. And nowadays their recess is cut short. Sometimes they're in aftercare and they're not really doing anything physical. And so part of it could even be they're just not tired enough, but also are their sensory needs met? So sometimes weighted blankets, things like that can help. I mean, that has nothing to do with EF. That's just my experience of having a sensory kid and knowing other sensory kids and what they need. Having that stimulation and that sensory input kind of helps calms things down.
Okay. Here's a parent who says that your lecture has made a lot of sense to her, and she wants to know how to get teachers at school to model and go through these steps.
That is a $64 million question. No, just kidding. So I think that we do need more training. As far as professional development, I don't know. I should be careful what I say. I'm trying to behave, but I think that it would be helpful for more people to understand what this is, what's going on, and what we do about it. And many teachers out there are open to learning more about it and to getting more information. The books that I had in the resource slide, if you have those books and you can just take out little pieces, I mean, if your kid qualifies for a 504 or an IEP, you can certainly get executive functioning goals in there, and have teachers or aides or whoever is working resource people with the student work on that with the student. But as far as like educating your teachers, I think it's just difficult, and it just depends on how open they are to learning about it and what they can do about it. If your child doesn't have access to having a 504 or IEP.
Okay. I'm seeing an acronym that I don't understand, so I'm just going to read the question and you'll probably know it. What if a student has both dyslexia and CAPD along with executive functioning?
Right, so that's the central auditory processing disorder.
Oh, okay, got it.
So I mean, I probably addressed their issue before, but the idea is they have to be addressed separately. And I would say, with the CAPD, you make sure that you go to an audiologist, because we did. I mean, with my son, I was like, are you not able to process what's going on here? Like, why are you having trouble with this auditory information that's coming in? Is it the auditory processing? Is it the attention? Is it the phonological processing? What's going on in there? So we went to the audiologist and they did a bunch of different tests, and they do things like, they put on headphones and one thing comes out of one ear and one thing comes out of the other ear, and then you have to only pay attention to one of them. So they'll say, report what you hear in your right ear. How well your brain is able to do that. And again, that's focusing on the signal and ignoring the noise. And so, so if you have that and dyslexia and EF, then the CAPD kind of has to be addressed, I would say, separately and first, before you probably really focus on the other, especially in a classroom setting. So I think it's still going to be difficult to make progress if you're still having trouble getting signal from noise in a classroom setting. So you want to make sure you address that separately. But with the dyslexia and the executive function, I mean, that's basically any EF kid I see, they also have dyslexia, and they may have had lots of work on the dyslexia before they come see me, but then you can work on the verbalizing and the working memory with that student moving forward.
I think this is a good question. Do all structured word inquiry tutors approach teaching a child with dyslexia and executive functioning and ADHD in the same way? Is this part of structured word inquiry?
No, and so unfortunately with structured word inquiry, that is a linguistic-based method of investigating words. The implementation of that in terms of how you're going to teach students is there. It doesn't say anything about that, right? It's more about you as the tutor understanding words and how they work. So I kind of have had all of the dyslexia and executive functioning and ADHD experience, and then came to structured word inquiry, and was able to kind of figure out how to tie that in with stuff that I was already doing with my students. If you are just learning about structured word inquiry by itself, no, it doesn't really address any of those issues. So you have to figure out, with my knowledge of the language that I am learning, how am I going to implement this with my students, and then take into account all the other issues that they have.
Questions keep coming in, but I think we probably just have time for one or two more.
Okay.
Let's see. This one is about reading comprehension. A child who is profoundly dyslexic has excellent verbalization skills, actually, but terrible processing speed. He's learning to decode, but he can't comprehend what he decodes. When he listens, he comprehends perfectly. So how does this fit in?
So a lot of who I see now are students that have been taught how to decode but still can't read. And what I mean by that is I've learned there's a difference between decoding and reading. With reading, meaning you're seeing something in print and you're getting meaning out of it. Decoding means you know how to pronounce it. So they're kind of separate things. And so what I have is quite a few students who spent a lot of time learning how to decode, but they're still very slow, they're not fluent, and their comprehension is not where it needs to be. And that really comes from the fact that they're solely operating on a phonological level. They're not operating on a meaning and structure level. So when they see words, they're not getting the same information out of it as if they had studied the structure and the meaning of the word along with the phonology. I mean, that's kind of a whole, I asked about doing a follow-up to this in the spring if people are interested. I was thinking I would love to do an EF, and so this was EF and dyslexia, but I would love to do an EF and SWI in math one if people are interested, because I think it would be really helpful to dive into that in a little bit more detail if people wanted to learn more about it. That's kind of too, I mean, right now, getting into detail, it would, we're already over anyway. So, and I was also thinking if people want to email me questions, I mean, I have no sense of how many more questions there are, but if people want to email me questions, they can email me at theliteracydr at gmail.com. I can see if I can
Okay,
answer more
you'll have
questions.
to let us know how many questions you get, because I think there's not very many people have left. Let me just say that they didn't disappear at the end of the hour. I'll just do one more then, since you've given them that opportunity. And this one is about, actually there's a couple here. How does this fit in with students who forget to plan for homework? And there was another one that was kind of related to that. Why don't you start on that one, and I'll see if I can find the other one I thought was related.
Okay. So when it comes to, so something like homework, it's nice actually to start with one thing, right? And that's what I've had to do even at my house, but also with my students. So if we're having trouble writing down homework, then that's where the whole reward the behavior you want comes in, but you also have to set them up to successfully do what you want them to do. So you need to have not only the resources like a planner or a calendar on their phone or something that they're going to use to actually write down what they're supposed to be doing. They also actually have to, check what they wrote in, where they put it. But you also have to have kind of a monitoring, a self-regulating monitoring thing going on. So checking in and checking out. When I get into school, what am I supposed to be doing? Before I leave school, what am I supposed to be doing? When I get up in the morning, what am I supposed to be doing? And those are the kind of things, again, you only want to focus on one thing at a time. Start out with the visual cues, whether it's a checklist or whether somebody has this awesome idea that she does now where she takes a picture of her son ready for whatever it is they're going to do. And then she says, you have to match this picture. So if we're going to soccer practice, here's a picture of your bag with all the soccer stuff in it, and you with everything you need on you, do the picture. I thought that was a really interesting way to not only give them a visual cue, but to then help them start being responsible. And then if they can store that picture, that helps them. Then they just have to, you know, check in and think through and then move forward. But I've done morning routines with lots of students where it's like, okay, so let's walk through, verbalize imagery, what you need to do, and then you need to have some kind of visual cue until it becomes automatic. But, you know, for the classroom, it's a little bit different. I mean, you can't really expect a classroom teacher to do a lot of this stuff because they've got so many kids and so much going on. But at home, for sure, focus on one thing at a time. If you focus on too many things at once, it's overwhelming. So if it's just like, okay, you forget to bring home your planner and your lunchbox and your water bottle. So we're going to work on leaving school at the end of the day. And we're going to talk through it, and we're going to role play, and we're going to use imagery, and we're going to verbalize it, and we're going to have a visual cue at school. And once they're able to do it, you can start pulling away the accommodations and they're able to do it on their own. And then an example of abstracting yourself out of the process would be, okay, so when we wanted to work on leaving school, what did we do? How did we accomplish that? Okay, so now what are we going to do if we want to work on our morning routine? So now you're not telling them the process, but you're saying, let's apply the process we use here to this. Then the next step could be, okay, now you're good at that and you're good at that. What's something else that you think you have trouble with or that you're struggling with? So you start pulling yourself out of that process and having them start contributing more and more and being responsible for more and more.
Okay. I will do one last question. I think you should maybe give your email address again, and there's a lot of comments about your suggestion for a follow-up session. The last question, where would you go to get a diagnosis of an executive functioning disorder?
Okay, so let me just put in, you can still see this, right?
Right.
Oh, so the literacydr@gmail.com. Let me go back into slideshow. And then just in typing that, I forgot what you just said. What did you say? What was the other thing you said?
The last question will take, where do you go to get a diagnosis of executive functioning disorder?
So I don't do any kind of assessment formally. I only do informal stuff just because I like to see what's going on with the student. You can read any kind of report about a student and it's not the same thing as actually seeing them in front of you and how their brain works. But the reports that I get are usually neuropsych reports, so a neuropsychologist. Sometimes an educational psychologist, but I would say neuropsychologist is usually the one who's going to do the executive functioning assessments and give you a diagnosis. And often, I mean, they generally do put in recommendations for classrooms. Somebody asked about the classroom. So I've done that even with my son, taking the reports in and say, you know, here are the recommendations. So if you do get an assessment, you get a diagnosis, you can take that stuff into the school just to give them, to help them kind of figure out what they need, what the student needs in the classroom.
Okay, I think that's 18 minutes past our top of the hour. So thank you again very much. And I think you'll be getting some emails.
Okay, sounds good. Good night.
Great.